So I've done some genealogy research on my family, and during that process I found out a couple of interesting things. On my paternal side, my great-grandfather, this is Abe, he was born a slave, and he was bought by a man whose name, I believe they said, was Jones, which is how the surname Jones came in. A lot of the times what happened is that they were given different names, and when they became free, then they chose the names that they wanted, and some of them took on the name of the family that they were with, if they were with a good slave master, or maybe the plantation where they were, or just made up a name. So it makes it harder to search your family roots beyond what name they were given when they were born. So we were able to go as far back as Jones. And so we found my great-grandfather, Abe Jones, was born a slave in 1860, I believe it was. And he was over in Freestone County, Texas. And he later on ended up becoming an entrepreneur. He had a general store and cotton gin. Also was a stockholder and vice president for the American Shoe Company in San Antonio, as well as having some mineral rights in an oil company. Going from being born a slave to amassing over 1,000 acres of land and owning a store. Being the first family in Freestone County to own a car was a really big thing. So, and he always taught that there's no such thing as can't. The word can't is not a word, it doesn't exist. It's you can do it or you don't do it, but you can always try. So never say I can't do something. He was very big on that. And he played a really big part in how my dad raised us. And then he married a lady named Dolly Mae, and then that's how my dad's dad and my dad and everyone else came along. So it's really interesting to see someone go from having literally nothing and literally being nothing but someone's property to being your own person and owning your own business and having your own land. To me, that says a lot about how far you can go, and to me it pretty much eliminates anyone having the excuse of I can't do this because I mean, if he can do it with all of the things that we now have access to now, why couldn't we?
That fundamental truth that out of many we are one, that while we breathe we hope, and where we are met with cynicism and doubt and those who tell us that we can't, we will respond with that timeless creed that sums up the spirit of a people. Yes, we can.
So to me, that's a really big, important thing about Black history is where you came from and where you're going. When you know where you were, it really makes it hard to make an excuse as to why you can't go further. Yeah, the first car that they owned was a 1923 Model T Ford. So that was a pretty big accomplishment for anyone back then, let alone a former slave. This picture here, this one is the country store that he owned and operated. And one of his daughters worked there as a clerk and did the bookkeeping. And then this one was one of 3 cotton gins that he owned as well. The downside of this research was finding out some of the bad things that happened back then and to some of the ancestors. So this is my great-grandmother, and her name's Lovey. She's half Irish, half African-American, and her brother was back in 1922, was falsely accused of raping and murdering a 17-year-old Caucasian girl. When the author of this book, Monty Akers, he wrote this book in 1999, Flames After Midnight, it was discovered that the actual killers were white men, but back then, who cared? It was just another reason to take out hatred on someone of color. So they got one guy, and he, according to the book, was basically beaten and tortured until he confessed. And then he named two others that were also guilty, one of them being my great-granduncle, Johnny, and then another guy. And so they were captured and taken to the county jail. Several people, including law enforcement, knew that they weren't guilty. They still were treated as though they were guilty. In this article, they had mentioned how the townspeople came and took the three men from their cells, and they took them into town square, and they tied them to a plow, which on the book is hard to see, but right here in the middle there's a plow where they tied them in one at a time, and they castrated and burned them alive. And my great-granduncle was the last one, and apparently, from what I read, the townspeople were not pleased at how quickly the process of killing them was going, so they made his even worse. So they tied a big rope, which had been soaked in water, around his neck and around his feet. They then threw him in the flame for a moment and pulled him out, threw him in again and pulled him out, and continued to do that until the rope burned and he clasped his arms around the plow and refused to be dragged away, meeting his death as soon as he could. So they tried to prolong his death, and when they threw him back in, he just grabbed a hold and wouldn't let go so that he could die on his own terms. But the town stood around and they watched, women, children cheering, collecting souvenirs afterwards, and they were very proud of what they had done, even though they knew that they were actually innocent. So that's the downside of history, is to the ugliness that was back then. And even though we see a lot of ugliness today, we've still come a long way, and stories like this helps us to realize how far we've come, and hopefully teaches us a lesson of where we don't want to go again. It was history, and it helped me understand things. When my great-grandmother as a kid would tell us, you know, girls to be careful when we're out, and, you know, be careful of men and don't trust them, and, you know, it's not safe, and all these things that she would say, I just thought she was this paranoid old lady, and now I know, no, she wasn't. She had good reason. She knew what happened to her brother. There was another relative that I read in this book, was a cousin who, it had just been mentioned in passing, might have been with the three accused when what happened. Johnny, my great-granduncle, and they also saw on their way to their new home our cousin Shadrick, I believe was his name, hanging from a tree because they decided that he was guilty too. I mean, it was a very bad thing. It made national news, and the town where all of this happened, from what I understand, ended ultimately being like a ghost town, because they went from being a very prideful place to a very shameful place once the national spotlight hit them. Here's a copy of the article from back then when it happened, and the headline on the article says, 4 Negroes pay penalty for brutal murder. So we had a memorial put together for my great-granduncle, and painted a portrait based on descriptions of him and surviving family members. And that's this portrait it's a little hard to see, but he was a very handsome man. He was fair-complected, dark hair, blue eyes, Spitfire, that was the Irish in him. But he was a good man, recently married at the time of his death, no kids. But this memorial basically was a way of healing, and it actually brought quite a few people into town, including, I later found out, some descendants of the guilty party. And so it actually took something that was really ugly and brought it back to the surface, and became peace and forgiveness And on the memorial, what we have put on it, it says, Johnny Cornish, 1903 to 1922, a loved one who was taken away too soon. Without memory, there is no healing. Without forgiveness, there is no future. And I think that kind of sums up everything pretty perfectly. I mean, hopefully we'll never go back to anything that bad again. But to me, Black history is remembering where you came from, and just like any other history, where you came from and where you're going, and not to repeat the mistakes of others, learn from the mistakes of others, and learn from the good things as well.
Let freedom ring, and when this happens, when we allow freedom ring, when we let it ring from every village and every hamlet, from every state and every city, we will be able to speed up that day when all of God's children, black men and white men, Jews and Gentiles, Protestants and Catholics, will be able to join hands and sing in the words of the old Negro spiritual, free at last, free at last, thank God Almighty, we are free at last.